Hello and welcome back. This is the first of the topics that we'll be looking at under the question of setting a background, and I want to talk about post-socialism, try to raise the question of is there a post-socialist condition? The term post-socialism gets knocked around a lot, and it's used to refer to a set of states. What these states have in common is that up until a certain period of time, they had governments that at least called themselves socialist, and we can raise the other question as to how socialist they were and whether state socialism is socialist or not. This is an outside topic, but what's common to these perspectives is the assumption that all of the states that had this type of regime at one time fit into a group. That is, they share a set of conditions and a set of problems, and therefore they can be looked at all as one analytically as experiencing the same types of issues. And I want to explore this by looking at a couple of touchstones in the literature. So let's move right into it. The first person whose work I want to look at who explores this question in a good detail is Zsuzsa Gille, who poses the question. There's a picture of Zsuzsa there. Is there a global post-socialist condition? And I want to walk you through her argument and try to bring up some of its implications for you. First of all, she points out, and this is something that I think will be recognizable to all of you, that there is a dominant narrative in the story of post-socialism, and this is what we might call the Cold War narrative. That is, that in the period from 1945 to about 1990, some people use 1989 as the turning point, there was a conflict between the East and the West, and this conflict was won by the West. So it's put in terms of international conflict for power, for dominance in a part of the world, and a victory, which is a meaningful victory by one of the parties in this conflict. In addition to this dominant narrative, there are some alternative narratives that have varying degrees of prominence. At least one of them is raised frequently, and that is the narrative that internal opposition to regimes, especially in culture, played a meaningful role in their demise. And sometimes this is mythologized too, of course. This will come as a surprise to none of you. And there are some other recognizable alternative narratives. The proposition that the regimes that called themselves socialist decayed, lost legitimacy and will over time. In addition to this, there are several conspiracy theories that that there was some kind of hidden motive or hidden group of people behind the end of socialist regimes. So these are all there as kind of framing narratives that are available to a different degree in telling the story. And Gille wants to propose some alternative ways of understanding these. And what she proposes is what she calls a relational perspective. First of all, she raises the possibility that we can talk about West and East, if we do want to talk about West and East, as having histories that are mutually constitutive of one another. That is to say that it is impossible to talk about East meaningfully without talking about West and the relation of East to West, and that the converse is also true. It's impossible to talk about West without talking about ways that this is constituted by relation to the East. And one of the reasons this is important for us is that then it allows us to place what was called socialism into a kind of context. And in particular, it raises the question of whether we can talk about socialism as existing as an economic system that had some social and political correlates outside of a world system that was fundamentally capitalist. That is to say that it's possible to take a very broad context of global economic and political history and put the experience of post-socialist states in that context. Now, all of that is kind of fun, but why does it matter? Let's talk a little bit about some reasons why it might matter. First of all, we can talk about some general narrative frames of the experience of states after the end of socialist regimes, and you can see it going in two directions. On the one hand, there is a tendency toward political liberalization, or is in most cases a tendency toward political liberalization, that is the establishment and consolidation of democratic regimes. And at the same time, there is a dimension of economic neoliberalization, that is privatization of public services, expanding the private economy, very often reduction of social welfare, of legislative and other practices designed to promote equality and so on. So these two things are happening at the same time. States are becoming politically more liberal and economically more neoliberal. And we could argue that these have contradictory effects. That is, that the consequences of one of these dimensions of change tends to be democratic, and the other one tends to be anti-democratic, to work against democratic. Second, if we want to talk about privatization and ways in which economic life and the social dimensions that accompany economic life are changing, privatization happens on a framework of state socialism. That is, the things that are privatized are institutions and industries that were established according to socialist principles. And one of the things that this means is that the people who move into positions of influence in the new privatized structures are people who were in positions of influence in the old public structures. And the consequence of this is then that a kind of capitalist order is constructed, but it's constructed on the basis of social capital, the connections that people within the system have with one another, and informality, rather than being contract-based or formally based, as we tend to understand it in some more traditional understandings of capitalism. Another approach that we can take is to talk about chronic underdevelopment, particularly after 1965, in the part of the world with regimes that called themselves socialist, and we can talk about different ways in which globalization was experienced in different parts of the world. And we can talk about this in the post-colonial parts of the world. We can talk about it in the post-socialist parts of the world, if we want to use that term. And we can also talk about the ways in which it is experienced in states that have become more fully integrated into global systems. So if we compare the experience of, say, the post-socialist states of Europe with the experience of states that had been peripheral but moved into the core of Europe, we may be able to get some insight there into trajectories of change. Another element has to do with values, and what a lot of people will tie the demise of and the loss of legitimacy of socialist systems to is events like the Chernobyl disaster. I see that I left a letter out on the slide. Sorry about that. Now, this was a case, we could argue that a lot of the legitimacy of state socialism derived from an invitation to values. That is, that as much as people understood that they had states that were in many ways inefficient, that they had a standard of living that was lower than the standard of living in other parts of the world, they could always make the argument, well, at least we're on the right side of history. At least we have a system that is based on socialist values and equality and taking care of people. That is to say, materially we're worse off, but people had the ability to think that they were morally better. And the reason the image of Chernobyl becomes important in this is that this is a case in which there was an environmental disaster with major effects, in which the state hid information, then provided false information, failed to protect people it was obligated to protect. That is to say, the socialist system that justified itself on the basis of values failed to live up to the values that it promoted, which devalued the legitimacy of the system. And with that, then, what people came to accept, because they were forced to accept as a consequence, was risk. And this is when the states of the region, the states that we call post-socialist, entered into, if we want to borrow the term from Ulrich Beck, the sociologist, both reflexive modernity and the risk society, the society in which it's understood that activity involves risk and that this is part of the cost of engaging in social life. And there are some ironic elements to this. if we want to go particularly to Southeast Europe, a lot of the fundamental ideas that come to the core of neoliberalism, at least according to the economic sociologist Joanna Bachmann, have their roots in the so-called Yugoslav alternative to socialism. That is, this attempt to develop a market system within a socialist context. So the system of self-management that was developed in Yugoslavia became a source of a lot of ideas for what later became the leading neoliberal intellectuals in economics. And so we see a communication going on here in which socialism and anti-socialism mutually constitute one another. But what I really want to draw attention to here is the paradox that liberal dreams, like the dream of democracy, very frequently come into conflict with the outcomes that are produced by the means that are applied to achieve them. That is, they come into conflict with liberalization on the political side and liberalization on the economic side. Now, if we move into the work of some critics from the region, I want to talk a little bit about the critique of post-socialism that's offered by Ines Prica. Ines Prica is a Croatian anthropologist, and what she is doing fundamentally, she is trying to offer a critique of the post-socialist period, a critique of the idea of post-socialism, by raising questions about it. And what are the questions that she raises? First, she says one of the dominant narratives of post-socialism and states experiencing post-socialism is the idea that it is a return to a frame of historical development that was interrupted. So a return to Europe, a return to normality, something like that. So all of the changes that are seen as being implemented in states in this period are regarded as a kind of restoration. But she asks, what does it mean if the thing that is being restored on the rhetorical level never really existed on the factual level? That is, if there were not functioning capitalist states and market economies in the places where they are being built now. Second, she asks if we accept that that there is such a thing as a post-socialist society, that is some kind of set of phenomena that unifies the experience of all of the societies that have had a particular kind of regime. When does a society stop becoming a post-socialist society, and when does it just become a society, that is a community that can be considered in its own terms? Third, she raises the question, if we want to talk about this kind of condition, who are the best observers of this condition? Is it people from the outside, people coming from environments where the system that is in theory being built has already been experienced, or is it people from the region themselves who are experiencing the material consequences both of the old order and of change? So who is a better positioned observer? Is it an insider or an outsider? She makes a weak argument for the position of the insiders. She says one thing that insiders are familiar with is the experience of crisis in local culture and the crisis code, as she calls it, that emerges from that. But we need to discuss the question of what that is and why it's meaningful. Next, she raises the question of pessimism, of the idea that all grand projects are bound to fail, and raises the question, how do we consider the origin of pessimism? Does it originate from the failure of the grand narrative of socialism and the ongoing set of failures of the narrative that is continuing of post-socialism, or does it come from smaller experiences, ones that are not on the historical level, that have to do with the everyday lives of people in these environments? There are several others. I will not read out the whole list here, but I think that what a lot of the categories of critique that Prica is getting at in her analysis have to do with the privileged ontological position of transition and the supposed goal of transition, that the goal of states, post-socialist states, if there are post-socialist states or post-socialist societies, is to adapt to transition. And to the extent that they do not do this, this is regarded as a deficiency or as a failure, and that we need to be conscious of this privileged ontological position in order to approach it empirically with a critical attitude. And we can talk about, if we want to concentrate on the states of former Yugoslavia, some dimensions of this that make the question especially complicated. One of them is that, in contrast with some other post-socialist states, the experience of socialism is not universally remembered as negative in all of the states of former Yugoslavia. If we want to talk about European states that had regimes that called themselves socialists, there are only two where these regimes were not established by some kind of external intervention, like an invasion or conquest by the Soviet Union, but rather by the military victory by domestic forces, and those two states are Yugoslavia and Albania. The other complicating factor for the former Yugoslav states is the role of the war of the 1990s and its dominant position during the period of so-called transition, because war had the effect of pausing active political life, of suspending debate about politics, and of freezing or of reifying any discussion about identity. Now, let me make a little detour here and talk about teleology. That is, teleology is the idea that there is some end of things, that history is, in some meaningful way, moving in a certain direction. And I've put up this diagram here. This diagram will be recognizable to those of you who've studied Hegelian philosophy, and will also be recognizable to those of you who've studied Marx. The idea, the dialectical idea, which Marx derives from Hegel, is that every thesis produces its own negation, the antithesis, that this is resolved in a synthesis, and the synthesis is a new thesis, which then will produce its own negation again and be resolved again, and that this is how history moves, is by a series of contradictions that are resolved. And where is history going? Eventually, and this line can continue and continue and continue, but it's hoped that eventually the state of truth is reached, that is, the state at which there are no more contradictions, and this is the end of history. Now, whether there is an end of history, this is a question that I cannot answer, but it's a question that political ideologies answer. The official version of the socialist ideology said it is when socialism is achieved that contradictions are resolved, there is no more class conflict in society, and history can be created freely. And the reason that I bring this up, this is an idea that few people will say that they believe now, but if you look at the ways in which transitions to capitalism or to liberal democracy are justified, they follow a similar logic. They say that this is the eventual endpoint of history. And this is one of the reasons why institutes for Marxist-Leninist studies that used to exist had very little difficulty carrying on the same kind of activity that they took on before as political, sociological, and philosophical research, and calling themselves institutes for liberal democratic studies, because the logic was very, very easy to follow. Where does this lead us? It leads us to some open questions that I hope we're going to be taking on in the discussion. First, is it sensible to talk about the existence of a post-socialist world or of a kind of post-socialist phenomenology? And is Southeast Europe a part of it? If it is a part of it, is Southeast Europe meaningfully distinct from other post-socialist environments? And we can also ask whether it's internally consistent, all of the parts of Southeast Europe, which is diverse in its own terms. And we can probably also raise some related questions, some cognate questions, if we ask the question of whether there is a post-conflict condition in addition to a post-socialist condition, and does it carry with it all of these kinds of grand narratives and positionings and assumptions that we've just explored in talking about the post-socialist condition.